Welcome to Classics Unraveled, where we pick apart our modern media in search of the tasty classical content within. Jon Christianson is my name, and on behalf of our sponsor, Memoria Press, the best of the best in classical homeschooling curriculum, I encourage you to subscribe and join over 500,000 homeschoolers who have found success using MP. Visit memoriapress.com to learn more. William Shakespeare, celebrated playwright, foundational innovator of English as we know it, and honestly, maybe a little played out. Ever since his big debut in 1589, his plays have been played and played again and again, his words spoken and spoken about in every arena of cultural output. It's hard for something that stands center stage in the public eye for so long to stay fresh, and we've done just about everything we can to do so. But 400 years later, after so many performances and productions, so many commentaries and conspiracy theories, what can we do with Shakespeare that hasn't already been done 100 times over? Is there any new ground for the Shakespearean craft to explore? Of course there is! Set Othello at the Alamo! Woo! Yeah!
John!
Perhaps you haven't noticed, but nowadays, creative settings are the last frontier of the enterprising Shakespeare adaptation. Just play with the dials of time and space and put Macbeth on the moon, or have Midsummer during Mardi Gras, and you've got yourself a playbill. In fact, the least likely setting for a Shakespeare play you'll find nowadays is Elizabethan England, or even less likely, whatever time and place is directly suggested by the play itself. Does this do anything for the plays? Do we have any business disturbing the context of Shakespeare's intent? Does a new setting for an old story make it greater or lesser than it was to begin with? Not that you can stop it or anything, it's much too late for that. We've been leading Shakespeare into unknown territory for quite a while now, like Voodoo Macbeth. This notorious 1936 production by Orson Welles set the Scottish play in the Caribbean jungle with an all-black cast and replaced the imagery of Scottish witchcraft with Haitian voodoo. Welles thought that voodoo was a much more ominous and intimidating threat to the average New York theatergoer than medieval sorcery. If that's not to your taste, then just a walk away from Harlem is the setting of the beloved musical West Side Story, which, unlike the previous play, is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet in story only. The organization of characters and events is a close copy of the original, but it does notably diverge from the tale's original track in its final act. In Romeo and Juliet, of course, both of the lovers die, but in West Side Story, well, I'll let you connect the dots. Whether it's Voodoo Macbeth or West Side Story, whether we change the setting alone or the entire script, it's not strictly clear why we keep doing this to Shakespeare. Is The Merchant of Venice improved by removing it from Venice? Does it matter if Macbeth isn't Scottish? It's easy enough to say that the English literary tradition is so deeply saturated with his work, that Western storytelling is so indebted to him, that whatever Shakespeare touches, he makes better. That's not what we're asking. We're asking the opposite. Does anything that alters Shakespeare make Shakespeare better? To answer that, let's talk about classical theater. As the saying goes, at the end of a tragedy, the hero is dead, and at the end of a comedy, the hero is wed. And that is so. However, there's more to comedy and tragedy than two sides of the same theatrical coin. Comedy arose from the rustic and light-hearted fertility hymns sung in the Greek countryside. This rusticity is preserved in classical comedy as an early pastoralism, a celebration of the simplicity and satisfaction of country living. Even those comedies that take place in the city, such as the New Comedy of Menander, almost all involve some natural phenomenon offstage, providing an unexpected solution to an urban problem. A young girl is orphaned because her father was shipwrecked in a storm, but the old beggar turns out to be her father the whole time. That sort of thing. Classical comedy's pastoral quality is exalted by their Shakespearean successors. In his comedies, the order of civilization is set against the relative disorder of nature. The impediments to the marriage of Orlando and Rosalind in As You Like It, or of Hermia and Lysander in A Midsummer Night's Dream, are distinctly civic or legal ones. The law and order of civilization is in the way of their love and happiness, Only by their flight into the forest does the relative chaos of the woods lend their problem a natural or supernatural solution. Love, in its classical sense of passion and chaos, adopts a healthy and wholesome dimension in the rustic world, such that the strictures of the urban world are jubilantly overcome. Tragedy, meanwhile, descends from the ritual sacrifices in the worship of Dionysus. What began as a religious event evolved into purely secular and artistic stories with time, and the literal sacrifice of an animal was swapped for the narrative sacrifice of a human victim. This sense of sacrifice or loss is preserved in the classical tragedy by reenacting the fall of a great man, by exploiting the solitary weakness in an otherwise worthy individual to lead to his tragic loss. The philosopher Aristotle considered tragedy to be the ultimate form of literature, such that there was no possible improvement upon the formula of tragic storytelling. To him, tragedy transformed the greatest horrors of the human condition, the death or destruction of the greatest of men, into a cathartic emotional event that purged the people of their vices. Classical tragedy's cathartic quality is deepened by their Shakespearean descendants. We don't know how much first-hand knowledge the bard had of Greco-Roman stagecraft, but the tragic tales of Lear and Macbeth closely resemble those of Sophocles' Creon or Aeschylus's Agamemnon in their precarious union of personal and political sins. In Shakespeare, however, these tragic flaws work their way across entire casts of characters, be they the hubristic ambitions of Lear's daughters, or the spiteful feud of Romeo's and Juliet's families, or the fickleness of Julius Caesar's public. Thus, each is a sort of compound tragedy, where the fall of the great is paved by the fall of lesser men. So, in both comedy and tragedy, the plots of Shakespeare's stories, even his silliest ones, are unmistakable echoes of his classical predecessors' plays. It's in this latter quality that we can rightly call Shakespeare's works a part of classical tradition. Classical storytelling gives us stories that are in some way universal, that are literally fictional but thematically true, that convince us by their giddy heights and desperate lows that what they have to say matters as much to us as it does to those walking the boards. So, if the point of a classical play is to tell true tales, then if you pluck its personae out of that time and place, its story should still hold. Better yet, if its universal truth is proven by the particulars of a strange new setting, then such an adaptation might just be an improvement. Indeed, when Voodoo Macbeth was made, the island nation of Haiti had recently fallen under US occupation, and the American public was only newly aware of Haitian voodoo at all. Just so, in Shakespeare's time, to Shakespeare's audience, witchcraft was not some distant memory. King James had written a treatise on the subject of witchcraft only 10 years before Macbeth's first run. Wells rightly supposed that voodoo would be as alarming to his audience as witchcraft was to that of Shakespeare. Most importantly, however, Wells was working with an all-black cast, and Haiti was a sovereign state of ex-slaves. Wells saw this as a unique opportunity to put the privileges and intrigues of Macbeth's stolen kingship into black hands, unheard of at the time, and to take the moral crisis of ancient kingdoms and apply it to a young and trailblazing nation. In both cases, Wells played with potent thematic links between his setting and his source material. As for West Side, its setting in the American melting pot lets the family feud of Montague and Capulet take a position along racial lines, and a gangland setting expanded upon the sorts of conflicts that might interfere with the love of two innocents. The push and pull of family bonds act differently on love than the bonds of nationality. And to apply Romeo and Juliet thinking to the American discourse on race relations necessarily leads to certain unfavorable conclusions against a sharks versus jets worldview. West Side is also a different kind of adaptation in its abandonment of Shakespeare's script, which allows the play to take some significant liberties, not the least of which is that they're all singing and dancing. An ending where Juliet survives puts Romeo's folly and rashness in a whole new light, by his death leaving her with lifelong regret. It isn't very often that a Shakespeare adaptation actually changes the through line of the plot, but doing so can be a powerful criticism or validation of the original. Seeing what it's like if things go otherwise lets us see the value of the story's authentic arc, just as Maria's survival ensures that the suffering caused by Tony's death will persist long after the curtain closes. I just spoiled West Side, didn't I? In both cases, these adaptations showed their audiences that, If these stories are universal in their reach, then Macbeth's Scotland and Juliet's Verona are merely starting points. A change in setting is in fact an entirely classical thing to do, and that is not where I wanted this video to land. I'll be honest with you, I don't like it when they do that. If you're like me, then you want nothing more than your Elizabethan stage plays to look like Elizabethan stage plays. You might not know this, but I was a theater major in college, and after watching quite a few unusual setting choices, I developed a distaste for the whole idea. I found the gimmick of taking Julius Caesar and setting it in Las Vegas to be just that, a gimmick, a meaningless ornament on a masterpiece that needs no ornament. So, when I began this video, my plan was to tear it all down. However, back in my Thor video, I said that what makes a classical character is that he defines a class or a sort of persons. You can take away his face and reveal 1,000,001 real people with the same traits and truths. Just so, with stories, a classical play is one whose story is true in a universal way. So, if Shakespeare told universal stories and this modern adaptation thing reveals another dimension of that universality, then not only is Julius Caesar at Caesar's palace allowable, but it may just actually expand on the merits of the original play. Or it might not. It might just be really bad. And it probably will be. That's the thing. Even if we accept the artistic legitimacy of this kind of adaptation, anything that can be done excellently can be done unexcellently. Just because Shakespeare in space can be better doesn't mean that it has to be. So, if I can't get what I want and defeat these adaptations altogether, I can still be as annoying and pedantic as I please with those adaptations on a case-by-case basis. Let's look at a few popular film adaptations of Shakespeare and say which ones do anything to improve upon their originals. Ran by Akira Kurosawa. I know that saying Kurosawa is good at movies is like saying Shakespeare is good at plays. It's kind of obvious. But this adaptation of King Lear is really a masterpiece. You wouldn't think that feudal Japan is an effective alternative for mythical England, but this is possibly the most classically competent adaptation of Shakespeare committed to film. Nothing in a Kurosawa film is accidental. Every word as it's spoken and acted, every moment of movement and of stillness is a measured and meaningful entity in his work, and Ran is no exception. Per its Shakespearean basis, though, reworking Lear as a Japanese warlord almost automatically reworks Lear's tragic flaw as well, and to great effect. In the original, Lear's decision to exalt his elder daughters and expel his youngest daughter is a personal failure in judgment, as he cannot distinguish the true merits of his children. In Ran, it is Lear's or Hidetora's obedience to the strict honor codes of his people that recognizes the warnings of his youngest son as dishonor rather than filial concern. Thus, the follies of a foolish king expand to the strictures of a cultural code that prevents kings and princes from being good fathers and sons. So, in Lear, it is the man who suffers from his folly, but in Ran, it's the kingdom that suffers from its cold customs. Speaking of Japan, As You Like It by Kenneth Branagh. This is among the better of Branagh's many Shakespeare films. Now, better doesn't exactly mean better known or better liked, and in fact, this production was controversial for orientalizing Shakespeare, for treating its Japanese setting as an exotic novelty for the use of a mostly British cast. However, this is significant and valuable to our purposes. It uses a foreign tradition and the European artistic expression of the strangeness of that tradition as a cultural analog for the pastoral tradition. If Shakespeare sends his characters into the forest of Arden to let the relative chaos of the wilderness triumph over their troubles, then Branagh exchanges that natural instrument of change for a cultural one. Arden's status as an otherworld, upon which the order of civilization cannot prevail, finds new territory in this production by extending to the limits of the known world, not vertically, by descending from the city to the wilderness, but horizontally, by sailing to a foreign shore. Now, both of these examples are pretty good. There's thoughtful thematic work in each of them. Let's climb a little further down the ladder and see just how bad these can get. Forbidden Planet, believe it or not, is supposed to be The Tempest. This film is certainly a sci-fi classic, but its Shakespearean roots require some digging to reveal. Here, the magician Prospero is replaced by the brilliant scientist, Dr. Morbius. His island becomes a lost planet of alien technology. His daughter Miranda becomes the blonde bombshell Alteria, and the brute Caliban becomes an invisible monster, generated by the machines beneath the planet's surface. We discover that the monster is the combined subconscious of the planet's original inhabitants, unleashed by the technology of those whose creations drove them to extinction. And Dr. Morbius is driven at length to cast aside his mechanical marvels, just as Prospero abandoned his magical arts. Thus, Forbidden Planet turns the Tempest's sorcery into a parable of human ingenuity. The limitless intellect is a lawless intellect, and the conquest of everything we want entails the destruction of everything we are. So, actually, Forbidden Planet turns out to do Shakespeare pretty well, too. I'm still looking for a bad example here. Romeo plus Juliet by Baz Luhrmann. Here is a hard pill to swallow. Set in what's essentially mid-90s Los Angeles, the sun-soaked district of Verona Beach is a mess of urban noise, beach punk beats, operatic requiem, and LA gang aesthetic. If you can get past the first 10 minutes of relentless nonsense, there begins at last the familiar story of Montagues and Capulets. And by the time Romeo finally locks eyes with Juliet through an aquarium in the men's bathroom, it's hard to explain. There finally emerges an island of sensibility amidst the chaos of Luhrmann's setting. At this point, it gets really captivating, actually. The romance between these two is electric in a way you don't typically see. It's a tragedy, after all, and we're not supposed to agree with their starry-eyed folly. But this feels good. This Romeo and this Juliet, they invite you in. They give you a dose of their love drug, and your heart is beating just as fast as they are all the way to their grave. And by the time you snap out of it, you realize just how easy it is to be as reckless as Romeo, as naive as Juliet. You know what? I like this one. I'm not supposed to. I'm supposed to be coming up with bad Shakespeare adaptations, but I like this one. One more check for the good column. Let's get at least one bad one, okay? What's the worst Shakespeare adaptation in modern memory? Joss Whedon's Much Ado About Nothing. Resetting this comedy at a rich, yuppie dinner party kills this play. It doesn't expand the context, it removes the context. There are no sharp edges in a world comprised only of cocktails and smug conversation. The characters all share their airs of stylish dispassion and spend most of the play being very satisfied with themselves. Thank you very much. Of course, since the film hews close to the original script, the overwhelming conceit of the characters necessarily gives way when things go wrong for the star-crossed Claudio and hero. Perhaps all we can salvage from this exercise in pretension is how poorly its West Coast self-importance holds up to something as earthy and fundamental as a Shakespearean love contest. I suppose that says something about our contemporary upper crust, that the rarefied air of the who's who of Malibu is toxic to meaningful bonding, and that only by falling from that social grace can true love take flight. It works. No. It doesn't work. It can't work. It makes sense, but no, I can't. Joss Whedon's Much Ado About Nothing is not about to be on the good column. Can I watch it again? Do you have a copy, Bryce? I'm willing to bet he didn't even do it. Joss Whedon wasn't even on the set. It's bad. It's a bad movie. How can a bad movie work in a Shakespearean? I'm not going to do it. That's wrong. Just scrap the video. No, they cannot know. Maybe I've got this whole universal storytelling thing mixed up with what's that?
Joss Whedon!
Oh, please, I'm begging you. Can anyone do Shakespeare? Can I do Shakespeare? In the end, it appears Shakespeare is a true universal storyteller. There is no stopping Shakespeare. Shakespeare wins. Thank you for watching this episode of Classics Unraveled. If you enjoyed my unraveling, then like this video and subscribe if you wish to see whatever we unravel next. I am Jon Christianson. Fare thee well.